talk about the Diddy case, because what I'm seeing a lot in the streets, and by the streets I mean social media comments, are people saying things like, well, is this a domestic abuse trial? Are they proving the sex trafficking charges? Because, it sounds like everyone was consenting and you can't, put someone in prison because of their sexual kinks and yada, yada, yada. So I wanted to look at the charges, because to understand if the prosecution is doing their job, you really want to look at what the charges are. So, and I think, this has been described as a sex trafficking case, and it largely is, because the majority of the charges are sex trafficking charges. But I actually think the more interesting ones, and the ones that are going to be more problematic for Diddy, I think that is the one racketeering charge. So I want to talk about the sex trafficking charges, and I'm going to talk about those pretty quickly, because those are not the ones that I think are most interesting. So first, it goes without saying, Diddy has denied all the charges against him. And one of the things that his defense team is saying is that, these are all consenting adults. So let's look at it. So I have the indictment here. Okay, the indictment, of course, is not new. It's been out for a while, but I think as we're talking about the case, it makes sense to look at the charges. So Diddy is facing 5 charges, okay? The first one is racketeering, and then the others are related to sex abuse. Sex trafficking, rather. So let's look at the sex trafficking ones first, because again, those are not the ones that I think are the most interesting, and those are not the ones that I think are necessarily gonna be the most problematic for Diddy and his legal team. So, all right, so the racketeering is like 10 pages. So the sex trafficking you get to in page 11 of the indictment, okay? So sex trafficking, you're talking about, in this case, forcing someone to engage in commercial sex. So commercial sex being paying someone for sexual acts. And so there have been, there's been a lot of debate about consent with this, right? And I do think that when it comes to a moral conversation, people can feel how they want to feel about sex work, but these are questions of law, right? So the question is he engaging in the act of transporting people for commercial sex, where he's paying them for different things? And are they doing it of their will? Is he coercing them? Is he forcing them? So that's count 2, which is sex trafficking by force, coercion, or fraud. Count 3, transportation to engage in prostitution. And then there were 2 additional charges that came up later. So Diddy was initially charged, and then later prosecutors added 2 more charges for a total of 5. He first had 3, now he has 2 more for a total of 5. 4 of the 5 are related to sex trafficking or transporting someone for the purposes of prostitution. So the new charges that came up are interesting, because they expand the date range. So the initial date range of the charges was 2009 to 2018. So then prosecutors came back, and they can do this, they do this is pretty common. As they learn more information, they can add charges or they can change the language. And so that's what they did here with the superseding indictment. So the first charges were 2019 to 2018. Then they came back and said, okay, 2021 to 2024, there are additional charges. There's additional activity that took place from 2021 to 2024. So that's pretty recent, okay? In the superseding indictment, they also added new language that speaks to some of the violence that he's accused of. And there's a quote that I want to read you here. And this, I've heard it mentioned a little bit in the media, but not nearly, I don't think it's generated as much attention as I expected it to. The prosecutors say he, quote, kidnapped and carried and displayed a firearm to a female victim, and that the defendant, Diddy, dangled a female victim over an apartment balcony. So that was part of the superseding indictment. So the reason I wanted to get the sex trafficking charges out of the way is because those are the ones that I do think are gonna be, maybe not for the jury, but for the court of public opinion, the ones where people are gonna say, well, the man can have whatever kinks he wants to, and there's nothing wrong with that. So let's assume that none of those charges stick. okay? So let's talk about the racketeering, because here's where I think people have not been paying enough attention. And this is where I think it gets really, really interesting. So what is racketeering? Okay, so racketeering is basically saying that you are using your business as a criminal enterprise. So you have a legitimate business, but you are using the resources of that business. That can be your employees, it can be money from the business, it can be anything. You're using resources from the business to carry out criminal activity, which essentially then makes the business a criminal enterprise. So if you are the CEO of a company, you're the boss, and your business is carrying out criminal activities per your request, then the government says, okay, that makes you the head of a criminal organization. So this is the one count that I think is going to be hardest for Diddy to beat, based on just the few days that we've seen so far. And we're just getting started. The trial has been going on for about a week. It's expected to last for 6 to 8 weeks. So again, just getting started. So let's look at what they're saying, okay? They're saying that Diddy used employees, resources, and influence to engage in crimes. And this is the list of the crimes, okay? Sex trafficking, which I just spoke about. Forced labor, so forcing someone to work against their will. Kidnapping, arson, bribery, and obstruction of justice. So those are the crimes that are alleged to have been committed under his guidance, leadership, as the head of Combs Enterprises. So then there's detail that prosecutors go into about what those crimes consist of, the alleged. All of these are all allegations. Diddy, of course, has pleaded not guilty, and he is vigorously defending himself, okay? So first are the claims of physical abuse. So what prosecutors say is that there was a tremendous amount of physical abuse, and that's one of the things that they are really gonna be hammering away at over and over and over again. So physical abuse towards women and others, okay? Flying commercial sex workers to his location. Again, you can think what you want to think about whether or not sex work should be legal, but the question is was he engaging in this activity of flying commercial sex workers to his location? Assault. Now keep in mind, each one of these things are crimes, but what ties them together is the racketeering. So the allegation that you're using your business to conduct all of these things, you're using your business resources to facilitate these things. So assault, which then he's saying he would allegedly use staff members, his employees, to try to bribe people to keep them quiet. So again, you're using your employees to assist, okay? Using his employees, this is a quote from the indictment, to carry out, facilitate, and cover up his abuse. Okay, using security staff, household staff, personal assistants, and high-ranking supervisors to facilitate these alleged crimes, okay? They go into more detail. So one of the things that's talked about a lot is trying to keep people quiet after alleged crimes took place. And that's one of the ways that they say staff members and employees were used, okay? So they were used to conceal his crimes. This is language from the indictment, not my language. They were used to, quote, conceal his crimes. There was a lot of use, allegedly, of violence, use of firearms, threats of violence, coercion, verbal, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. Transporting commercial sex workers, unlawful acts of violence. I'm just reading down the indictment. Intimidation, manipulation, bribery, threats of retaliation. So these are all the things they are saying took place either directly by Diddy or by his employees at his request. So when we're talking about the freak-offs, let's talk about the freak-offs for a second, because this is the place where there's a lot of debate about, people's preferences in the bedroom and whether they should be held criminally liable for that, and what does that have to do with the racketeering. So here's what the freak-offs have to do with the racketeering. So the argument that prosecutors are trying to make is that the freak-offs were all based around bringing commercial sex workers to wherever Diddy was to engage in these freak-offs. So there were a couple components to it. A, was he bringing commercial sex workers to wherever he was? Because that in and of itself would be a crime. And then the second component is, was he coercing or forcing anyone who was not a commercial sex worker, which, based on Cassie's testimony, she would fall under that category. Was he coercing other people to take part? How does that tie to the racketeering? They're then saying that he was using his employees to facilitate all that. So you're allegedly committing a variety of crimes. You're bringing commercial sex workers to you. You may be transporting them across state lines. They have alluded to many times, although I don't think this has come up in the trial yet, to them being transported internationally as well, which I think is part of the reason that Homeland Security conducted the raid on his homes. If you'll remember, it wasn't FBI, it wasn't DEA, it was Homeland Security. And I took note of that at the time when they raided his homes in Miami, California. I can't remember where else it was, but that was Homeland Security that conducted those raids. And so prosecutors have, in the documents, several times alluded to the fact that some of this was taking place internationally as well. So A, is this happening, right? Are you bringing commercial sex workers? Are you transporting them for these freak-offs? And B, are you then coercing others against their will to participate, okay? Then there's other alleged crimes that are tied to the freak-offs. So there's the drug use, which Cassie testified and spoke to on the stand. So are you providing narcotics for the purposes of these freak-offs? Is there violence that is part of the freak-offs? Are there assaults? Is there, are you beating people up while these freak-offs are taking place? And these are all things that Cassie testified about. And keep in mind, again, like I said, we're not even done with week 2. And there's going to be about 6 weeks of testimony where we'll hear more. So A, are all of these things happening? And B, are your employees facilitating? Are they, because you're forcing them to, because they work for you, are they setting up hotel rooms? Are they doing part of the work of booking the commercial sex workers? Are they getting drugs for you and making sure that they are at the location of the freak-off where you need them to be? Are they helping you cover up acts of violence? So if you allegedly beat someone up and then don't want anybody to see them for a week, say, or a couple days later, are the employees helping you hide that person and keep them hidden from public view so that nobody knows what happened? So that's where the racketeering comes in, and that's where the racketeering is tied to the freak-offs. Because one of the things that I've seen, one of the questions that I've seen come up over and over again is, well, he's not being tried for domestic violence, so is the prosecution proving their case? So ultimately that's up to the jury, but I'm just interested in kind of explaining, based on the indictment, how I think they are going about making that case. One of the things that I think we're really going to get into, and here's what blows me away, and here's what I think we're talking about enough. So there's a lot of conversation about the sex trafficking, as there should be, because that's the majority of the charges are tied to that. But listen to these other alleged crimes: forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, obstruction of justice, assault, narcotics distribution. I mean, it's like a laundry list of things that they're alleging took place. And I think they have done, a decent job thus far of trying to establish that was taking place and going through the witnesses and having the witnesses, establish that as well. Let's talk about the guns, because there's a lot in here about firearms. And there's actually something, hold on, I really want to share this with you because I have not seen this talked about anywhere. Where's my paper? Of course, I can't find the paper, but I have it committed to memory. So in pre-trial documents, okay, I have not seen this talked about anywhere. I'm very interested for us to get to this part of the trial. In pre-trial documents, prosecutors had to argue why they thought Diddy should not get bail, because they thought he was a threat to witnesses and to the community and yada, yada, yada. So they had to give some kind of evidence as to why they think he's a threat. You can't just say, I think somebody's a threat. You have to say why you think they're a threat. So they said in those pretrial documents, they allege that in 2011, Diddy himself, because they refer to the defendant, so this is not something that he paid goons to do, allegedly, this is something he did with his own hand, broke into somebody's home with a firearm and kidnapped them. This is an allegation. Prosecutors have to prove this. It hasn't even come up in the trial yet, but this is foreshadowing of what we are likely to see and hear from the prosecution, because they're just getting started. And clearly they started with the freak-offs, because I think that's very much the linchpin. So the firearms, lots of references to firearms, brandishing firearms to intimidate and threaten others as a way of carrying out these criminal acts, okay? I'm just going through the indictment, and this is none of what I'm talking about has to do with the sex trafficking. This is all of this. There are 11 pages just on the racketeering. So the reason I wanted to get on here and talk about that is because everybody's talking about the sex trafficking. Everybody's talking about the sex crimes. Everybody's saying, not everybody, but there's a lot of people who are saying like, well, they're not proving that he committed sex trafficking. Fine. That is not for me to decide, but what I'm fascinated by is the racketeering, which is the majority of the indictment. The indictment is like 18 pages, and more than half of it, the indictment is 13 pages, 14 pages? 14 pages. The indictment is 14 pages, and 10 of them are on the racketeering. So everything that I'm going through right now is the racketeering, and I feel like they haven't even really gotten started with that yet. They haven't brought in any evidence yet, as far as I can tell, on bribery or arson. We kind of, alluded to the extortion with Cassie's mother, alleged extortion with Cassie's mother. So it's starting to creep in, but they haven't even really started to talk about those things. That's my point. So I think that is gonna slowly become more of a central focus here of this case. So the violence, that's going to be a really hard one, I think, for people to, rationalize or justify or understand or explain. It's very hard to, it's kind of like the video that came out of the Cassie drag. Before the video came out of her being beaten in that hotel, people are always going to doubt survivors. They're always going to say, well, we weren't there. We don't really know what happened. So similarly, I think when some of this evidence starts to come out, it'll really reshape the way that people are seeing things. So the allegations here are that Combs engaged in violence, threats of financial and reputational harm, and the violence included kidnapping and arson. So I don't know if the arson is related to the alleged Kid Cudi car bombing. We should find out soon. I don't know if that qualifies as arson, or some kind of other act of violence? Or are they talking about something completely different that we are not even familiar with? Because they do reference arson several times. And again, what I find interesting is the fact that in a lot of cases, they're accusing Diddy of doing these things himself, which is just, I mean, think about that for 1 second. Think about one of the richest and most successful men in the world, one of the richest and most successful Black men in history, a media mogul who is accused of committing these crimes himself. You know, that is just something that never, ever I would have thought we'd be talking about. You know, my expectation, I just, you know, I would not have expected a billionaire to be accused of breaking into someone's home and kidnapping them at gunpoint. That blows my mind. Okay, I'm gonna get back to the indictment. Let's just get this nose right. I'm gonna take a look at the comments. Hi. This is my first time looking down at the comments. This is my first live, so I definitely have to get in like a little bit of a groove, because trying to look at an indictment and do my makeup and read comments, it's a movie. It's a lot. I'm almost done. Okay, so let's wrap this up. All right, so back to the alleged violence. So, quote, on multiple occasions, again, I'm reading from the indictment, this is what prosecutors are alleging. These are all allegations only. Quote, on multiple occasions, Combs threw both objects and people. He threw both objects and people. I read that to mean he threw people. I mean, it says Combs threw both objects and people, not objects at people. So very curious to what that means. As well as hit, dragged, choked, and shoved others. So they're alleging this pattern of physical violence. And again, to refresh your memory, if you're just joining, in the superseding indictment that came out just last month, they allege that he, quote, dangled a female victim over an apartment balcony. Okay, that just came out last month. That was in the superseding indictment. They added 2 charges for a total of 5. 4 of the 5 are sex trafficking. The 5th is racketeering. And in the new charges, they both expanded the date range. So they included dates from as recent as 2024. And they added this language about allegedly dangling a woman over a balcony. I'm assuming we'll hear more about that. So that's the kind of violence that he's being accused of in this racketeering count. Pressuring witnesses. Okay, this is a big thing. This is something that comes up over and over and over again. And this is a big part of the reason that he was denied bail. Diddy, remember, applied for bail, requested bail 3 times, I think. I stopped paying attention after 3. And he was denied bail each time. And one of the reasons that he was denied bail over and over again is because prosecutors said he is tampering with witnesses. He's intimidating witnesses. He's, you know, calling them a million times. He's inventing stories that he wants them to tell. And so this is something that comes up in the indictment as well. There's this, over and over again, there's this accusation that he would pressure people to try to cover up his alleged crimes. So they say, quote, pressured witnesses and victims, including through attempted bribery, to stay silent and not report what they experienced or knew to law enforcement. He, quote, allegedly, provided these victims and witnesses with a false narrative of events in an effort to conceal Combs's crimes. And they say that he himself was recording some of those calls. Okay, so the racketeering count wraps up with this. So they go through all of these alleged things that took place. And then they say, okay, here's a summary. Here's a summary of all of it. multiple acts involving kidnapping. And they cite the state law that is applicable. So in this case with the kidnapping, they cite California law. So we can assume that these acts, these allegations took place in California, but multiple acts involving kidnapping, not just one, multiple. So again, moving away from the conversation of the sex trafficking, this is just like, think about any one of these charges. You know, if somebody was this